Good afternoon, and thanks for joining Washington, D.C.-based Jennifer Schaus & Associates in our Get FAR Cited in 2020 complimentary webinar series. As you know, the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations, is the rulebook that the federal government must follow when making purchases. Our webinar series pulls from contracting experts to explain each part of the FAR. It is complimentary and recorded. We will post all of the recordings on our website and YouTube channel, where we have over 300 government contracting webinars available for download. A special thanks to our webinar partner in this series, the National Veteran Small Business Coalition Education Foundation. Please visit their website to learn more about the organization. We would also like to thank our friends at Open to FAR for their sponsorship. If your organization is interested in sponsoring this series or one part, please contact hello@jenniferschaus.com. And now a little bit about us. We work with primarily large businesses to help them navigate the federal marketplace. We work with both product and service companies, as well as software firms. Our clients span the globe and include publicly traded organizations in a variety of sectors. We provide market analysis reports, contract administration, contract vehicle assistance, and more. All of our services can also be built into a training course for your team. Learn more about us on our website. We would also like to let you know about some ways to reach government and government contractors through us. We offer advertising and sponsorship opportunities through our weekly newsletter and also in our webinar series. For pricing or to place an order, please email us at hello@jenniferschaus.com. Now let's learn a bit about today's speaker, Fernand de la Vallée. You can find his contact information here. And today we're covering FAR Part 39 with Fernand. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thankful for your participation in the series, and the floor is now yours.
Well, thank you so much. Let's go to the next slide. I'm delighted to be here with you today and speaking about FAR Part 39. FAR Part 39 has two parts, and we will touch on each today in our discussion. The first is subpart 39.1, which is the general section. It addresses and references the Office of Management and Budget Circular A130, which we will talk about, the National Institute for Standards and Technology Standards, or NIST standards, as well as a prescribed Federal Acquisition Regulation Clause 52.239-1. Each of the parts of subpart 39.1 are listed here, and as I mentioned, we'll touch on each. The second part of subpart 39.2 is electronic and information technology, and this addresses the Section 508 accessibility. And I know for many contractors, there are a lot of questions about that because it seems to be a requirement that the government will generally address. But then how do we deal with that? And from the agency perspective, what's the objective there? So we'll talk a little bit about that too today. Let's go to the next slide. So FAR Part 39 addresses the acquisition of information technology systems. What's important, though, is that it focuses solely on non-classified or non-national security systems. So these would be the open systems, even if they're internal, so they're not open to the public, but also the public-facing information systems that the government maintains. So FAR Part 39 addresses them. One thing that I want to state right up front is every day we hear plenty about cybersecurity and maintaining the security of networks, including non-classified or non-national security systems. FAR Part 39 is essentially the step one level higher. So if cybersecurity is at tree level, this is one level higher in the cloud. So cybersecurity is certainly a component of FAR Part 39, but that's not its primary focus. Instead, it's talking about the more fundamental aspects and requirements that agencies have to have and abide by when they are looking to acquire information technology. Then the first aspect of FAR Part 39 is the directive that agencies shall identify their requirements in accordance with the Office of Management Budget Circular A130. That's the circular that's titled Management of Federal Information Resources. And actually, has been updated since it was originally put out there, and it actually addresses the concepts of strategic, managing information as a strategic resource, which I think is very important. In addition, if the particular system happens to be one for financial management used by the agencies for that, there's a second OMB circular that informs the agency of their requirements, and that's OMB Circular 127. Let's go to the next slide. In acquiring information technology, agencies have to identify their requirements according to Circular A130. Sometimes in the business, you've probably heard about when you're doing IT acquisitions, OMB Circular A130 is considered the one-stop shop for agencies' requirements. So it definitely is a definitive source of requirements. It directs the agencies to do a lot of things that obviously are fairly common sense. Things like to consider the security resources that are going to be required, to consider protection of privacy. And there we're talking about information that's protected by the Federal Privacy Act, which seeks to protect information belonging or about individuals like you and I. Also, the circular, although Part 39 doesn't apply to national security systems, it does address a component, national security and emergency preparedness. And then, of course, the Section 508, which is accommodations for individuals with disabilities, and it also addresses energy efficiency. There are tools that are provided to agencies. We have one here cited for you, the Electronic Product Environmental Assessment Tool, or EPEAT, and those standards, which again, agencies are expected to abide by. It also talks about other policies like power management requirements, double-sided printing, it's environmentally friendly, and things like that. But most important, best management practices for the energy efficient management of servers and federal data centers. Let's go to the next slide. What FAR Part 39 expects is that contracting officers will consider the rapidly changing nature of information technology by conducting continually and fresh market research in accordance with FAR Part 10, of course, and the application of technology refreshment techniques. Now that's really important, and all of us, even as consumers, appreciate this need, right? You've all heard about Moore's Law, which seems to certainly be very operative in the information technology field, where about every 2 years, if not sooner, we have generational jumps, not mere refinements, but totally new advances in the technology. Now that creates a real tension, right? Because in public procurement, contracting officers have to abide by the competition and contracting laws, which necessarily entail an amount of time to pull together, for instance, your solicitation, to get comments on it, to publish it, to give people time to respond to it, and then, of course, to evaluate your offers, and then to actually make the award decision and get past any kind of protest period and move forward gingerly with the contract. And as most of you know, that could easily take 18 months to 2 years to do. So here, contracting officers are reminded that even with that tension, they don't want to. They need to move with deliberate speed, but also account for the changes in technology and sort of include that or address that in the solicitation in an appropriate way for what they are acquiring. Now, with respect to financial systems, I'll mention that for agencies again, OMB Circular A127, their agencies are also reminded that they can only acquire core financial management software that has been certified by the Joint Financial Management Improvement Program. So they have to look to that approval level. Let's go to the next slide. So on the circular A130, this is your one-stop shopping document for OMB policy guidance. It's available online. Obviously, the agencies have to look at that to see what they need to do and make sure that they're following the federal expectations for information technology acquisitions. But contractors should look at it too, so that you understand what your customer needs and what your customer's inherent concerns are, as well as their objectives. Let's go to the next slide. The types of guidelines that you're going to see in OMB Circular 130 include the following. All federal information systems have to have security plans. Now remember, we're talking about unclassified networks, so even they have to have security plans. And that makes sense too, right? Because we all hear again every day, and in some cases, unfortunately, we are victimized by cyber criminals and cyber intrusions, incidents, I guess, as they are sometimes referred to. So even our unclassified systems have to have security plans to protect the information and the integrity of the information that are on them. So the COs will have to confer with their internal network security folks to make sure that they have an appropriate level of security as a fundamental requirement for IT that you're requiring. There has to be a formal emergency response capability for those upset conditions that are going to occur. Many times unplanned, right, but able to be anticipated. Whether they are things like loss of energy or power, to weather conditions, to inability to access physical components for a period of time, whatever the emergency response is, moving your workforce to teleworking might now be considered a component of that as well. Making sure that there's a single individual where the buck will stop when it comes to operational security. Okay, so ultimately, many are involved. In fact, all of us touching the system have to be involved, but one person ultimately has to have that responsibility and make those decisions. The Federal Management and Fiscal Integrity Act reports to Congress have to be made. That's something that contractors don't necessarily have visibility into, although they may contribute information. But the agency has to be aware of that requirement. Security awareness training has to be made available to all the government users and administrators of the system. So when you're looking to acquire a system, consider the training requirements as well. And then regular review and improvement, including contingency plans for the system, have to be a component of the contracting officer's planning. Let's go to the next slide. Another aspect that OMB Circular A130 requires a contracting officer to consider is the National Institute for Standards and Technology standards for IT. This is that entity within the Department of Commerce that you are probably most familiar with in terms of their, again, cybersecurity special publications like the 800-53, and then more recently and more pertinent directly to contractors, although 53 certainly is the special publication 800-171A. And the point here is that in acquiring information systems, the agency has to include the appropriate information technology security policies and requirements, including using the common security configurations that are available from the National Institute of Standards and Technology's website. Now, some of that is made a lot easier, right? So for instance, at a civilian agency, the contracting officer will likely include a specific safeguarding of covered contractor information systems type clause, something like the FAR 52.239 the 52.204-21 clause. And that would be a way to address at least the fundamental security requirements. At the Department of Defense, there are DFARS clauses, the 252, 204, 2010 clause, for instance, and clauses like that. And I know I may be misquoting, so I will correct that. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is a requirement, the management of risk, that is also imposed on agencies. Contracting officers obviously share in this responsibility when they're looking at and articulating the requirements for information technology that they want to acquire. Now, this is a really important, and I think sometimes not given the thought that's required, and that is before entering into contracts to acquire information technology, the agency really has to give some good thought to the risks, the benefits, and the costs that are going to be essentially part and parcel of the IT system that they're going to buy. Obviously, there are always risks. So what this is really asking is for the contracting officer in coordination and in consultation with the program officials and the others who are involved or going to be ultimately using the system, or the internal customer for procurement, to get with them and try to understand what the trade-offs, the risk trade-offs are going to be. Reasonable risk-taking, obviously, is always appropriate, but only when the risks are controlled or mitigated to the extent that they can be. And so having that discussion and having that planning is a very important aspect and requirement of FAR Part 39. The contracting program office officials are jointly responsible, so contracting and program office. That's what I mean about that collaboration with the internal customer at the agency, but also monitoring and controlling the risk even after you've selected the projects and the IT systems that you're going to use. Let's go to the next slide. So what are these types of risks? Everybody uses that word risk, but what does that mean? Well, FAR Part 39 helps the agency out by being very specific. It includes schedule risk, the risk of technical obsolescence, that Moore's Law thing, that you don't buy this great system only to find out that it was not only yesterday's technology, but the problem with yesterday's technology isn't that it doesn't work, it's that there's going to be a limited time in which it's supported by the manufacturer. So balancing that risk, the cost, of course, because sometimes the Chevrolet type system is perfectly able to meet all the agency's needs, but you can always buy the Cadillac or BMW version also. So cost often is associated with those different levels, and is going to be an aspect of the risk trade-off. The risks implicit with the particular type of contract that's going to be used to acquire, but that's an ordinary consideration, right, for procurement all the time. Technical feasibility, getting that right balance. But technical feasibility also would include things like when the agency is looking at its IT system, it's going to have users with varying degrees of knowledge and literacy in the use of the IT system. But you need everybody to use it, or as many as possible. So making sure that you get that balance where the power user can certainly get what they need out of it, but the novice user is able to do their job. Same with public-facing systems. You're going to have a great degree of differences in literacy. But you also want to address when you have a broad base, user base like that, even internal in the agency, the different types of equipment that are going to be connecting. You're going to have your supercomputer, possibly, certainly your mainframe or server computers, but you're going to have a variety of agency-issued laptops, some that are nearly ancient, as well as the more recent ones. But you need your system to be able to accommodate all or work with all. So that's a technical feasibility question as well. Dependencies, obviously, between new and existing projects or systems, balancing the legacy systems and continuing that with the new software or new components that are being purchased, the new equipment. The number of simultaneous high-risk projects that might be going on. Obviously, procurement and the program folks will have some insight into that. The funding that's actually available, and of course, program management risk is always a consideration. Let's take a look at the next slide. Part 39 suggests to contracting officers that to the extent that it's feasible, you use modular contracting. And for Part 39, the idea here is that you may actually make your electronic information technology acquisitions using one or more contracts in a successive interoperable manner, so iterative manner. So instead of just buying a lock, stock, and barrel, the entire turnkey system, it understands that you may need to use modular contracting where you buy pieces of it. And just an easy example based on our look at the requirements so far. You may buy, for instance, the laptops that are going to be deployed to your internal workforce. Then, by a separate contract, you may buy certain basic software for that, whether it's your word processing system or some agency-specific data tracking system or something like that. But remember, Part 39 said that you also have to acquire training. You need to make sure people using the system are trained. That might be yet another contract, right? Or it's an option built into the contract let to the vendor who's providing the software or the hardware. So that's the idea, is that basically the contracting and program folks have to be thinking about modular contracting and then coordinating it so that it is all implemented in a way that makes sense and gets you the information system on time in the configuration that you need. Consistent with the agency's information technology architecture, agencies should, to the maximum extent practicable, use modular contracting. I apologize for that typo there, just saw it, FAR Part 2.101, as it's defined there. And a aspect of this is also remembering that the general statutory preference for commercial items is still operative. So using fixed price or time and materials or labor hour commercial FAR Part 12 contracts is always a good choice and should always be a consideration when the agency is acquiring information technology. Let's go to the next slide. As we've touched briefly on a couple of these slides, an important aspect in the acquisition of technology, because of how rapidly it evolves and improves, is avoiding obsolescence. And here, FAR Part 39 advises contracting officers that a modular contract for information technology should, to the maximum extent practicable, be awarded within 180 days after the date to which the solicitation is issued. If for any reason the agency is unable to make award within 180 days, FAR Part 39 suggests that the agency should consider cancellation of the solicitation in accordance with whichever part you used, 14.209 or 15.206 if it's a negotiated procurement. To the maximum extent practicable, then, deliveries under the contract should be scheduled to occur within 18 months after issuance of the solicitation. So you see what's going on there. They're asking, within a year and a half. And again, that's just looking at the realities of the marketplace, and that everything from your computer hardware, to the software, typically is moving rapidly and getting to entirely new versions or new technologies in this type of period. Other things that the agency can consider, and again, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but is technology refresher clauses, where the agency is still trying to make award within 180 days and actually even get deliveries within 180 days. But they also have a provision that all the offerors are aware of and will offer to, which allows the agency to perhaps get a newer technology or have a delivery of more recent versions automatically done, either at a preset a price or at no additional cost in some cases, if that can be done. But again, the idea is cognizant that there are delays that are simply inherent in doing a federal procurement, that the agency still wants to get current, if not latest and greatest, information technology. Let's go to the next slide. So when acquiring IT services, the solicitation itself should not describe any minimum experience or educational requirement for proposed contractor personnel, except in two scenarios. One is that the agency's needs can't be met unless the agency is very specific about the experience or educational requirements for those who will actually provide the services. And that's not always going to be the case, but it sometimes may be. Or meeting the agency's needs requires use of other than performance-based acquisitions. So that's an important aspect that FAR Part 39 addresses. And this is obviously the acquisition of services, but that might even include the services, the maintenance, the help desks, perhaps even the training. That's the type of thing where the agency should be very considered and careful if it's going to articulate a minimum experience or educational requirement. Better to use a performance-based acquisition approach for that purpose. That's kind of one of those sleepers. I think a lot of folks overlook that, but there it is in FAR Part 39. Let's take a look at the next slide. An absolutely foundational issue for Part 39 is privacy, and privacy with respect to the information that's on the information technology system that the government's acquiring or that will be processed through it. And most of that information belongs to individuals. Now, remember I said that cybersecurity is always an important aspect, but this is what I meant, that Part 39 addresses sort of the fundamental issues even one level above. So we've all heard about the Privacy Act, and there's the citation on the slide for you at 5 U.S.C. 552A. It's also addressed in FAR Part 24 specifically. What we're talking about, though, is the Privacy Act governs the collection, maintenance, use, and dissemination of personally identifiable information. You've heard the acronym PII, about individuals that's maintained in systems of records by federal agencies. Now, this is important, obviously, because the public has to have confidence that any of their information that illegitimately may need to be in a system of records at a federal agency is protected and is just not going to be arbitrarily disclosed or accessed or used for purposes other than its intended, what the basis was for the individual to make the information available. The Privacy Act prohibits the disclosure of a record about an individual from a system of records, a federal system of records, without the individual's written consent. So obviously the system has to also be designed in a way where the information can be protected, and the government either will not intend to disclose it, so they won't need to go get the disclosure, or they have a mechanism to get the consent if they think that disclosures may be necessary. There are 12 statutory exceptions to disclosure under the Privacy Act. And these cover most of the routine uses or needs the federal government will have, and where the government will not be required to go get specific written consent from the individual. These are all laid out in 5 USC 552A small b as in Bravo, but there are things like need to know within the agency. The disclosure is required by the Freedom of Information Act. The data is necessary for use by the Bureau of the Census. The decennial census is ongoing right now, so some of you may have actually run into that personally, as well as in your job responsibilities. Statistical research is a use that's permitted. It's usually anonymized data, but that's a use. National Archives, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, has a right to access this data. There's certain permitted uses for debt collection, particularly in relation to taxes and things like that. But so privacy is a fundamental requirement. The government is going to also impose that requirement on the contractors or vendors by requiring the FAR 52 239-1 clause, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Let's go to the next slide and take a closer look to the requirements for ensuring protection of privacy. The agency has to consider, and so this contracting officers and your program colleagues, this is an absolute essential step, is that any contracts for the design or development or operation of a system of records that uses commercial information technology services, and remember that statutory preference suggests that you will often have this case, or commercial information technology support services, you have to include the requirement that the contractor is aware of and will abide as appropriate by or as applicable by the agency rules of conduct. And those are the rules that obviously limit access and use of information that's on the system of record, prevents any disclosure, prevents any further dissemination, except where it's absolutely necessary to do the actual contract performance, things like that. A list of the anticipated threats and hazards that the contractor should guard against. So remember, in the initial planning, the government was looking at the risks, and that included certain types of threats and hazards. And so some of these will actually be identified to the contractor or vendor, and a requirement that they be able to address it be a part of the contractual solicitation and then the contractual award. And then finally, a description of the safeguards that the contractor must specifically provide. And as I mentioned, some of that may be encompassed in the FAR 52-204-21 clause that will be included, the basic safeguarding requirements, but sometimes agencies may need some additional things or more, frankly, in-depth and rigorous requirements, as the Department of Defense does in its safeguarding and cyber incident clauses. And then finally, requirements for a program of government inspection during the performance of the contract that will ensure the continued efficacy and efficiency of safeguards and the potentially discovery and countering of any new threats and hazards generally has to be a requirement in the contract. So again, you can see FAR Part 39 is very, very focused on safeguarding privacy. Let's go to the next slide. So in the contract, a clause that typically has to be included when the agency is acquiring information technology, electronic information technology, is the FAR 52-239-1 clause, which I've set out in full text here for you. As you can see, it's a pretty short clause, but it really packs a lot in there. For instance, it has a basic prohibition where the contractor can't publish or disclose unless it has prior contracting officer's consent in writing, any details of safeguards that were designed or developed by the contractor under the contractor or otherwise provided to the government. And obviously that itself is a security measure, right? You don't want to publicize to the public that type of information where some folks might misuse or have bad intent to use that. To the extent required for a inspection or program of inspection to safeguard against threats or hazards to the security or integrity and confidentiality of the government data, the government will require the contractor to give the government access. Now look at the access requirement here and how broad it is. It's to the contractor's facilities, installations, the technical capabilities, operations, documentation, records, and databases, obviously all specific and related directly to the information technology or services that are being acquired. Contractors need to take note, though, of how broad that clause is, too. In some instances, contractors' facilities might be different than the installations or where the documents are kept or the records or the databases. So it may include multiple actual physical sites as well as systems. So contractors should keep that in mind as well when they are complying with a requirement imposed by FAR 52-239-1. And then finally, if there are any new or unanticipated threats or hazards that are discovered, whether by the government or by the contractor, or if there's a discovery that certain existing safeguards are not functioning, they've stopped functioning, then whichever party makes that discovery will immediately inform or disclose that situation to the other party. Now, the clause here is not very specific, doesn't say that it has to be in writing, for instance. The point, though, is a timely disclosure. So obviously each party can safeguard or take measures to safeguard. Because remember, privacy is the key consideration there. Let's take a look at the next slide. So this brings us to the second part of subpart 39, 39.2, and that's the Section 508 requirements. So when acquiring electronic information technology, agencies have to ensure. Now look, the responsibility is on the agency. So that's an important component of Section 508. That federal employees with disabilities have access to and use of information and data that is comparable to the access and use by federal employees who are not individuals with disabilities. So what are they talking about? This is similar to concepts in the American with Disabilities Act. The idea is accessibility and usability. So not only that you can get onto this, but that you can actually make comparable use of it by people that have limited capacities to see, to hear, or to exercise muscular or physical control. And the agency is concerned both about the federal employees with these kinds of issues, but also members of the public who will be seeking information or services from a federal agency and where they may need to access or use information or data on one of these electronic information systems or technology systems. So that is the whole concept and requirement imposed by Section 508. But the devil's always in the details, right? So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's go to the next slide. The main point I want to make on the next slide is there's no way in 1 hour or frankly 1 day or maybe even 1 week we could discuss everything about Section 508 that the agency or contractors ought to know. But here are two resources that are important for both the government and if you're a contractor or offeror that you may want to reference. And then these sites themselves will lead you to other resources as well. But let's talk about some of it in the time that we do have. Let's go to the next slide. So the is in Section 508 is accessibility and accessibility requirements. Those requirements literally for the supplies and services, the electronic information technology supplies and services that the agency must make sure are met are contained in 36 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 1194, which also provides certain exceptions. And we'll talk about those exceptions. Now, the agency, this is really important. You need to think about whether an exception applies up front prior to putting out the solicitation. The exceptions really are not something that are meant to be raised by the offerors or the contractor, but rather should be something that the agency has already thought through and anticipated or decided. And in fact, there's a process called an exception determination, which the contracting officer is required to, or the procuring agency is required to conduct and to do prior to award, with the exception of certain indefinite quantity contracts where the requirement will be satisfied in the initial award. Contracting officers that award an IDIQ contract have to indicate to the requiring ordering activities, so to your sister agencies, which supplies and services the contractor indicates comply with the accessibility requirements that were identified in the solicitation, and also let your sister agencies know where the full details of compliance can be found. Well, so how does that actually work in practice? Well, many of you may have heard of something called the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT, all caps VPAT. The VPAT is actually not a document, not a federal or governmental document. Instead, it's the trademarked document and process developed by the Information Technology Industry Council, in consultation, though, with the federal government, including the General Services Administration. What the VPAT is a table that contains information on how specific information technology, whether it's hardware or software, conforms with the accessibility requirements of Section 508. Currently, I believe they're using the VPAT 2.0 form. What you want to know about the VPAT is originally the concept was that the VPAT would be a tool that would facilitate the government's market research on understanding the accessibility features being offered by various products and by various vendors, and factor that into its acquisition decision. In practice, what the VPAT has actually become is something that the offerors use and fill out as sort of an accessibility conformance report, or an ACR. So what is this VPAT? Well, the VPAT is a form that has rows and columns. Each of the rows address different aspects of a product or services accessibility requirements. And that is grouped in sections. So, for example, you would have a section that addresses whether a mouse or a keyboard is required to control the software, or when images or color are necessary to understand the software and to use the software. And then when there are alternatives to text that might be available. Now you can see, remember we were talking about making this accessible and usable by people that might have challenges to their vision or their hearing or their ability to muscular agility. So you can see how these would make sense. So for instance, someone who has muscular control issues, a mouse or a keyboard may pose a challenge and may be an accessibility issue or usability issue. Similarly, for those with sight impairments, the size of text, the color of text may make a difference. So the VPAT has 3 columns that each of these rows go under. And the first column breaks down subsections of the actual 508, Section 508 accessibility requirements. The second column provides a product or service specific description of the features that the product has that are relevant to satisfying or addressing that section of Section 508. And then the third column will have comments and remarks, including any explanations that the vendor or manufacturer of the hardware or software wants to make known. And this provides the information on accessibility and usability that the agencies can understand and factor into their award decision. Now, does that mean that a product can only be acquired if it meets every single, checks the box on every single requirement in section that's listed in Section 508? And the answer is clearly no. In fact, sometimes sections will be inapplicable, or the explanation or the feature that's explained is seen to address it if not fully satisfied. But that information gives the agency sufficient information to make its acquisition decision. Let's go to the next slide. So let's continue the discussion of accessibility requirements. The requiring and ordering activities have to ensure that supplies or services meet the applicable accessibility standards that are in this part of the Code of Federal Regulations, unless there's an exception that applies. And that exception has to exist at the time of the issuance of a specific task or delivery order if the acquisition is being made under an IDIQ, independent delivery, independent quantity type contract. As a result, IDIQ contracts can include non-compliant items, but the specific task or delivery order issued for a non-compliant item has to meet the exception. As I mentioned, exception determinations are made by the agency, not by the contractor or offeror, and obviously they ought to be made in advance so that you can have competition by offerors who understand where an exception is understood to exist or that the government recognizes would apply to the specific procurement. When acquiring commercial items, the agency has to comply with the accessibility standards that can be met with supplies or services that are available in the commercial marketplace in time. So it doesn't have to be necessarily at the date of proposal, but certainly by the date of first delivery requirements. So it has to exist in the commercial marketplace in time to meet the agency's delivery requirements. The requiring official has to document in writing any non-availability issues, including a description of market research that they performed. That might be including, for instance, their review and comparison of VPATs, and which standards cannot be met, and provide documentation to the contracting officer for inclusion in the contract file. Let's go to the next slide. So what are the types of exceptions that an agency might determine exist? And so here's your basic list of that. The requirements in FAR 39.203 won't apply to electronic information technology that is purchased in accordance with FAR Part 13.2 micro purchases, but that was if you bought it before April 1st, 2005. Also, in any instance with respect to micro purchases, the COs still should, and they're strongly encouraged to comply with accessibility standards to the maximum extent that's practicable Another exception is it's not required for national security systems, but neither is FAR Part 39. So it's interesting that that's there, but I suppose that's a consideration for the agency. The third is that it's acquired by the contractor for the contractor's use incidental to the contract. So where the contract might require the contractor, for instance, to buy some information technology to do inspection or testing, and that's actually a requirement of the contract that they get that. They don't have to, you can make an exception to the accessibility requirements. Probably the most frequently encountered exception in my experience is the exception when the electronic information technology is located in spaces that are frequented only by service personnel for maintenance, repair, or occasional monitoring of the equipment. This is the so-called telephone closet or IT closet exception. Some of you may have seen that at your place of work, or maybe that is your place of work, where those rooms, sometimes they're small, but so closet may be appropriate. Sometimes they are full-size rooms where the actual equipment, backbone equipment, typically is located. And there, the public or the day-to-day employee isn't going to be the one accessing there or using there. That's going to be the professionals and the service providers that are highly skilled in the use of that equipment. So that's the idea. But that's a fairly narrow exception. So the stuff that's deployed on people's desks, and then certainly for the public, when they're accessing the system, this won't necessarily be the circumstance. And then the last potential exception available to the agency is that meeting the accessibility requirements would impose an undue burden on the agency. Let's go to the next slide and talk about what the undue burden is. Again, the offeror or contractor does not make this decision. This is the government's alone. And in determining whether or not compliance with any or all parts of applicable accessibility standards is an undue burden, the agency has to consider two things. The first is the difficulty or expense of compliance. And they're talking about the difficulty or expense ultimately that's going to be borne by the government, by the taxpayer. And then finally, the agency resources that are available to its program or component for which that supply of service is being acquired. Because it's really going to be a relative determination in terms of whether it's unduly burdensome. If you have the funding, and since the mandate is to make it as accessible and usable, programs with better funding might, their threshold for it being too expensive to comply may be higher than another program that's operating on a shoestring, the proverbial shoestring. But it's a trade-off decision. It looks at the difficulty of compliance as well as the costs or resources that would be required to comply, and then makes a judgmental decision about whether there's undue burden by making the requirement applicable to offerors. Let's go to the next slide. Because it is judgmental, but also because it's so important to satisfaction of the statutory requirements for accessibility, it's not surprising the agency has to document the undue burden determination. The requiring official is the one who does that documentation. They do it in writing, and they have to articulate the basically rational basis for an undue burden decision and provide the supporting documentation and put all of that, make sure that all of that gets transmitted to the contracting officer so that it resides and remains in the contract file. When acquiring a commercial item, an undue burden determination is not required to address individual standards that cannot be met with supplies or services available in the commercial marketplace in time to meet the agency deliverable requirements. And for more on that, you'll want to look at FAR 39.203, small c as in Charlie 2, regarding this type of documentation. Now that makes sense, right? Because when the requirement is going to be satisfied by commercial items, the consideration for Part 39 was whether it's actually available in the commercial marketplace. So if it simply isn't, and it's not going to be, you're not required to tell offshores that they have to figure it out and get it done. Instead, you can make the undue burden determination so that you can go buy the commercial items at the commercial market prices or better. So that brings me to the end of this presentation on FAR Part 39. Obviously, a lot of information and a lot of requirements and attention to detail that's imposed on contracting officers and their program personnel or agency officials that are making acquisitions, for instance, in an IDIQ context. And it is a consideration that's in concert with, but over and beyond just the pure cybersecurity type considerations that get so much attention these days. And then finally, we reviewed the Section 508 accessibility requirements, which again is a requirement that the agency has to meet, but that the offerors and vendors and manufacturers will provide information so the agency can figure out what the sensible and appropriate requirements for accessibility and usability will be in a specific electronic information technology acquisition. And with that, I thank you very much. Appreciate your attention today, and good contracting. Thank you.
Thanks for a great presentation, Fernand. And to our audience members, we thank you again for participating with us. If you have questions about this part, please contact our speaker with the contact information seen on your screen. And if you have any questions about federal contracting or need assistance with any of our services, please contact us directly. Thank you again for joining us.